When I went into the hills and vales to survey the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They told me this in Arkham, and because that is a very old town full of witch legends, I thought the evil must be something which grandams had whispered to children through centuries. The name Blasted Heath seemed to me very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it had come into the folklore of a Puritan people. Then I saw that dark westward tangle of glens and slopes for myself, and ceased to wonder at anything besides its own elder mystery.
Hello, my name is Michael, and I obsess. I come across something that grabs me and I consume until I can't take anymore, and then I'm on to the next. Some obsessions last a week, others a lifetime. It is my intention to explore these obsessions with you as they occur while the passion is hot. Welcome to Eclectic Obsessions. I discovered H.P. Lovecraft in high school. I devoured his short stories before moving on to the novellas and novel. Far and away, my favorite was The Color Out of Space, and it is that work we will be exploring on this episode of Eclectic Obsessions. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was an American writer who achieved posthumous fame through his influential works of horror fiction. He was virtually unknown and published only in pulp magazines before he died in poverty, but he is now regarded as one of the most significant 20th century authors of horror and weird fiction. Lovecraft was born in Providence, Rhode Island, where he spent most of his life. Among his most celebrated tales are The Rats in the Walls, The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Shadow Out of Time, all canonical to the Cthulhu mythos. Lovecraft was never able to support himself from earnings as an author and editor. He saw commercial success increasingly elude him in this latter period, partly because he lacked the confidence and drive to promote himself. He subsisted in progressively strained circumstances in his last years, and inheritance was completely spent by the time he died at age 46. Lovecraft drew extensively from his native New England for settings in his fiction. Numerous real historical locations are mentioned, and several fictional New England locations make frequent appearances. Some of Lovecraft's work was inspired by his own nightmares. His interest started from his childhood days when his grandfather would tell him Gothic horror stories. Lovecraft's most significant literary influence was Edgar Allan Poe. He had a British writing style due to his love of British literature. Like Lovecraft, Poe's work was out of step with the prevailing literary trends of his era. Both authors created distinctive, singular worlds of fantasy and employed archaisms in their writings. Another inspiration came from a completely different source: scientific progress in biology, astronomy, geology, and physics. His study of science contributed to Lovecraft's view of the human race as insignificant, powerless, and doomed in a materialistic and mechanistic universe. Often in Lovecraft's works, the protagonist is not in control of his own actions, or finds it impossible to change course. Many of his characters would be free from danger if they simply managed to run away. However, this possibility either never arises or is somehow curtailed by some outside force. Often his characters are subject to a compulsive influence from powerful, malevolent, or indifferent beings, as with the inevitability of one's ancestry eventually even running away or death itself provides no safety. In some cases, this doom is manifest in the entirety of humanity, and no escape is possible. Lovecraft began writing The Color Out of Space in March 1927, immediately after completing the case of Charles Dexter Ward. As he wrote the tale, however, he was also typing the final draft of his essay on horror fiction, Supernatural Horror in Literature. Lovecraft was dismayed at the all-too-human depiction of aliens in other works of fiction, and his goal for color was to create an entity that was truly alien. In doing so, he drew inspiration from a number of sources describing colors outside of the visible spectrum, most notably Hugh Elliott's Modern Science and Materialism, a 1919 nonfiction book that mentions the extremely limited senses of humans, such that of the many ethereal waves striking the eyes, the majority cannot be perceived by the retina at all. Lovecraft had used this concept previously in his 1920 short story From Beyond. Completed by the end of March, The Color Out of Space first appeared in Hugo Gernsback's science fiction magazine Amazing Stories in September 1927. The story was illustrated by J.M. de Aragon, an artist who produced occasional artwork for the magazine. In Lovecraft's story, the colors out of space are unknowable, non-humanoid, extraterrestrial creatures who suck life out of all living things in the area. They arrived in a meteorite that fell in a rural area west of the fictional town of Arkham, Massachusetts. The colors inhabit small, fragile globules within the meteor. They possess mutagenic properties. The crops on the farm near the impact site grew to great size and unnatural gloss, but this was useless as their taste was bitter, sour, and unlikable. Animals in the area were also affected, their bodies, behavior, and activity showing hints of alteration, such as leaping distances well above their normal capability, malformed body proportions, appearances, and footprints in the snow of unnatural configuration. Snow around the house melted faster than anywhere else nearby, and skunk cabbages of prodigious size and unusual color sprouted from the soil. The trees budded early and were observed to be moving even with no wind of any sort. Within a few months, all plant life near the site took on unnatural properties and odd hues to the point where the road running near it fell into disuse, owing to people fearful of seeing such a sight. Insects were also affected in a similar manner, their bodies and movement patterns noticeably altered from what was known through past experience and behaving in a manner contradictory as such. Cows grazing on grass near the site produced milk of worthless quality. The grass started taking gray colors and becoming strangely brittle. Horses in the stable one night were driven violently mad by it. The plant life in the area, even the mutated ones, started taking after the fate of the grass, turning brittle, growing smaller than normal, growing increasingly more hideous-looking gray, and in the case of the crops, tasteless. The insects followed suit, dropping dead rapidly. The vegetation thereafter began crumbling like dust into grayish powder, and it was soon discovered afterwards that the well water was of undrinkable quality. The rest of the farm animals also fell to the same fate. The poultry turned gray, rapidly died, and their meat found useless as food, being dry and of disgusting taste. Hogs grew massively fat, developed isolated mutations on their bodies, and soon after turned gray and collapsed like the rest of them, their meat found inedible. Cows were next. Portions of their bodies, or even the entire being, shrank incredibly. The result was the same. They all turned gray and died. Although all plant life in the area tended to die away, some, most notably trees, reacted in an unusual way. One member of the family claimed that the branches of some trees swayed also when there was no wind, although it is never established if this swaying was the result of specific manipulation from the alien species, or was merely another example of the unusual growths. The majority of the colors eventually returned to space in a dramatic fashion, with everything it had ever touched glowing with its unnatural colors and the trees pointing their branches up towards the sky. It then rapidly shot itself up into space, leaving a hole in the clouds as the only sign of its departure. All things organic that it had associated itself with crumpled into dust. A small portion remained in the well where it had originally taken up residence. The Color Out of Space became the only work from Amazing Stories to make Edward O'Brien's anthology of the best American short stories, appearing in the 1928 Roll of Honor. Gernsback paid Lovecraft only $25, approximately $361 in present-day terms, and was late in doing so, leading Lovecraft to refer to the publisher as Hugo the Rat. He never again submitted anything to the publication. Lovecraft did not write another major short story until the following year when he crafted the Dunwich Horror, although he did pen History of the Necronomicon and Ibid as minor works in between, as well as an account of a Halloween night's dream that he called The Very Old Folk.
But even all this was not so bad as the blasted heath. I knew it the moment I came upon it, at the bottom of a spacious valley, for no other name could fit such a thing, or any other thing fit such a name. It was as if the poet had coined the phrase from having seen this one particular region. It must, I thought, as I viewed it, be the outcome of a fire. But why had nothing new ever grown over those 5 acres of grey desolation that sprawled open to the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? It lay largely to the north of the ancient road line, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an odd reluctance about approaching, and did so at last only because my business took me through and past it. There was no vegetation of any kind on that broad expanse, but only a fine grey dust or ash, which no wind seemed ever to blow about. The trees near it were sickly and stunted, and many dead trunks stood or lay rotting at the rim. As I walked hurriedly by, I saw the tumbled bricks and stones of an old chimney and cellar on my right, and the yawning black maw of an abandoned well, whose stagnant vapours played strange tricks with the hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast, and I marvelled no more at the frightened whispers of Arkham people.
An unnamed surveyor from Boston, telling the story in the first-person perspective, attempts to uncover the secrets behind a shunned place referred to by the locals of Arkham as the Blasted Heath. Unable to garner any information from the townspeople, the protagonist seeks out an old and allegedly crazy man by the name of Ammi Pierce, who relates his personal experiences with a farmer who used to live on the cursed property, Nahum Gardner. Pierce claims that the troubles began when a meteorite crashed into Gardner's lands in June 1882.
It all began, old Ammi said, with a meteorite. Before that time there had been no wild legends at all since the witch trials, and even then these western woods were not feared half so much as the small island in the Miskatonic, where the devil held court beside a curious stone altar older than the Indians. These were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk was never terrible till the strange days. Then there had come that white noontide cloud, that string of explosions in the air, and that pillar of smoke from the valley far in the wood. And by night all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell out of the sky and bedded itself in the ground beside the well at the Nahum Gardner place. All around the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space, except where the earth had caved in, and whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the sages studied its surface curiously as they detached another and larger piece with hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, and as they pried away the smaller mass, they saw that the core of the thing was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be the side of a large coloured globule embedded in the substance. The colour, which resembled some of the bands in the meteor's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it colour at all.
The meteorite shrinks but does not cool, and local scientists cannot discern its origin. The stone is eventually destroyed by a bolt of lightning, and the lab specimens are destroyed when placed in a glass beaker. The following season, Gardner's crops grow unnaturally large and abundant. When he discovers that despite their appearance they are inedible, he becomes convinced that the meteorite has poisoned the soil.
Then fell the time of fruit and harvest. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchards were prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwonted gloss, and in such abundance that extra barrels were ordered to handle the future crop. But with the ripening came sore disappointment, for of all that gorgeous array of specious lusciousness, not one single jot was fit to eat. Into the fine flavor of the pears and apples had crept a stealthy bitterness and sickishness, so that even the smallest of bites induced a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heaven that most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road.
Over the following year, the problem spreads to the surrounding vegetation and local animals, altering them in unusual ways. The plants around the farmhouse become slightly luminous in the dark. Gardner's wife goes mad, and he locks her in the attic. Over time, Gardner isolates his family from the neighboring farmers. Pierce becomes his only contact with the outside world.
When schools closed, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Amy do their errands in town. They were failing curiously both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news of Mrs. Gardner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteor's fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her raving there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and ears tingled to impulses which were not wholly sounds. Something was taken away. She was being drained of something. Something was fastening itself on her that ought not to be. Someone must make it keep off. Nothing was ever still in the night. The walls and windows shifted. Nahum did not send her to the county asylum, but let her wander about the house as long as she was harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changed, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, and Thaddeus nearly fainted at the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked in the attic. By July, she had ceased to speak and crawled on all fours, and before that month was over, Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminous in the dark, as he now clearly saw was the case with the nearby vegetation.
Shortly after the onset of Mrs. Gardner's madness, the vegetation erodes into a gray powder, and the water from the well becomes tainted. One of Gardner's sons, Thaddeus, also goes mad, and Gardner locks him in a different room of the attic. The livestock turns gray and dies off. Like the crops, their meat is tasteless and inedible.
Thaddeus went mad in September, after a visit to the well. He had gone with a pail, and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into an inane titter or a whisper about the moving colors down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, but Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boy run about for a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself, and then he shut him in an attic room across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other from behind their locked doors was very terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancied they talked in some terrible language that was not of earth.
Thaddeus dies in the attic. Merwin, another of Gardner's sons, vanishes while retrieving water from the contaminated well. After 2 weeks with no contact from Gardner, Pierce visits the farmstead and witnesses the tale's eponymous horror in the attic. Gardner's final son, Zenas, has disappeared, and the color has infected Nahum's wife, whom Pierce puts out of her misery. Pierce flees the decaying house as the horror destroys the last surviving resident.
Questioning tactfully, Amy could get no clear data at all about the missing Zenas. "In the well. He lives in the well," was all that the clouded father would say. Then there flashed across the visitor's mind a sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line of inquiry. "Nabby? Why, here she is," was the surprised response of poor Nahum, and Amy soon saw that he must search for himself. Leaving the harmless babbler on the couch, he took the keys from their nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. It was very close and noisome up there, and no sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked, and on this he tried various keys on the ring he had taken. The third key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Amy threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars, and Amy could see nothing at all on the wide planked floor. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further, he had to retreat to another room and return with his lungs filled with breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. While he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt himself brushed as if by some hateful current of vapor. Strange colors danced before his eyes, and had not a present horror numbed him, he would have thought of the globule in the meteor that the geologist's hammer had shattered, and of the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought only of the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clearly had shared the nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about this horror was that it very slowly and perceptibly moved as it continued to crumble.
Pierce returns later that day to the farmstead with 6 men, including a doctor, who examine Nahum's remains. They discover both Merwin and Zenos's eroding skeletons at the bottom of the well, as well as bones of several other creatures. As they reflect upon their discoveries in the house, a light begins to shine from the well. This becomes the color, which spreads over everything in the vicinity.
It was the coroner, seated near a window overlooking the yard, who first noticed the glow about the well. Night had fully set in, and all the abhorrent ground seemed faintly luminous, with more than the fitful moonbeams. But this new glow was something definite and distinct, and appeared to shoot up from the black pit like a softened ray from a searchlight, giving dull reflections in the little ground pools where the water had been emptied. It had a very queer color, and as all the men clustered round the window, Amy gave a violent start, for this strange beam of ghastly miasma was to him of no unfamiliar hue. He had seen that color before, and feared to think what it might mean. He had seen it in the nasty, brittle globule in that aerolite 2 summers ago, had seen it in the crazy vegetation of the springtime, and had thought he had seen it for an instant, that very morning, against the small barred window of that terrible attic room where nameless things had happened. It had flashed there a second, and a clammy and hateful current of vapor had brushed past him, and then poor Nahum had been taken by something of that color. He had said so at the last, said it was the globule and the plants. After that had come the runaway in the yard and the splash in the well, and now that well was belching forth to the night a pale, insidious beam of the same demoniac tint.
The men flee the house just as the horror blights the land and then flies into the sky. Pierce alone turns back after the color has gone. He witnesses a small part of it try to follow the rest, only to fail and return to the well. The knowledge that part of the alien still resides on Earth is sufficient to disturb his mental state.
As the rest of the watchers on that tempestuous hill had stolidly set their faces toward the road, Amy had looked back an instant at the shadowed valley of desolation so lately sheltering his ill-starred friend, and from that stricken, faraway spot he had seen something feebly rise, only to sink down again upon the place from which the great, shapeless horror had shot into the sky. It was just a color, but not any color of our earth or heavens, and because Amy recognized that color, and knew that this last faint remnant must still lurk down there in the well, he has never been quite right since.
When some of the men return the following day, they find only a dead horse and acres of gray dust. The gardener's neighbors leave their homes and flee the area.
Everything that had ever been living had gone. 5 eldritch acres of dusty, gray desert remained, nor has anything ever grown there since. To this day, it sprawls open to the sky, like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields, and the few who have ever dared glimpse it, in spite of the rural tales, have named it the Blasted Heath.
In addition to being Lovecraft's personal favorite of his short stories, critics generally consider The Color Out of Space one of his best works, and the first with his trademark blending of science fiction and horror. Lovecraft scholar Donald R. Burleson referred to the tale as one of his stylistically and conceptually finest short stories. Joshi praises the work as one of Lovecraft's best and most frightening, particularly for the vagueness of the description of the story's eponymous horror. He also lauded the work as Lovecraft's most successful attempt to create something entirely outside of the human experience, as the creature's motive, if any, is unknown and impossible to discern whether or not the color is emotional, moral, or even conscious. E.F. Blyler described The Color Out of Space as an excellent story, one of Lovecraft's finest works, in his opinion the best original story to appear in Amazing Stories. The text of The Color Out of Space, like many of Lovecraft's works, has fallen into public domain and can be accessed in several compilations of the author's work as well as on the Internet. The 1965 film Die Monster Die, directed by Daniel Haller, is based on The Color Out of Space. The film stars Nick Adams, Susan Farmer, and Boris Karloff.
For their love in a world haunted by horror.
What was that?
Will the breath of the living be snuffed out by the hand of darkness? The monster lives in death.
Get out of this room.
Boris Karloff, never before more demoniacal. He takes you beyond the boundaries of shock.
Lovecraft scholar Don G. Smith claims that, of the scenes that are derived from Lovecraft's work, the Blasted Heath doesn't live up to Lovecraft's description, and asserts that overall the film does not capture Lovecraft's intent to play with the idea of an alien life form, completely different from anything humans can imagine. Smith considers Haller's work an imitation of Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe films rather than a serious attempt to adapt to Lovecraft's tale. Another adaptation, The Curse, in 1987, was directed by David Keith and stars Will Wheaton, Claude Akins, Cooper Huckabee, and John Schneider. It more closely follows the plot of Lovecraft's work.
There are places where nothing ever seems to change. But here, nothing is what it seems. He saw it.
Something came out of the sky. A meteor or something.
No one believed it.
Don't be talking about things you don't know nothing about.
Tastes funny.
It makes vegetables taste weird.
There's nothing wrong with the water.
It's making you sick. Can't you see that?
Now, there's no way to stop the curse. It has come from the heavens, but what it has brought is hell. Will Wheaton of Stand By Me must stand alone against The Curse, a film by David Keith from a story by H.P. Lovecraft.
Lovecraft scholar Charles P. Mitchell referred to the film as faithful to the author's original work, but Mitchell claimed that the last 20 minutes of the film are so disjointed that they virtually ruin the experience. The 2008 film Color from the Dark, directed by Ivan Zukan, is an adaptation set in Italy. The film stars Michael Segal, Debbie Rochon, Marissa Kay, Jerry Shanahan, and Eleanor James.
I'm afraid to go to his farm.
The bottom broke. Go take another bucket, come on.
And then he said the trees glow at night.
Glow?
Oh my God. What is wrong with me?
Ego te benedico. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Amen.
What's going on here? Pietro said you were sick.
Where are you? Libera sta mulher, Domine del Diablo, Domine Maisha. You bastard!
Your God doesn't exist.
It didn't!
You're back. Of course.
Lucia, I have something for you. Lucia.
Varför det ger ju den första?
Bloody Disgusting praised the film, stating Zukan managed to do the famous writer's twisted tale of unseen terror a really fair share of justice, by capturing the bleak, grotesque, and utterly frightening atmosphere of the source material very, very well. The 2010 film Die Farbe, The Color, directed by Huan Vu, is an adaptation set in Germany. It is shot mainly in black and white, the exception being the color itself. S.T. Joshi described it as the best Lovecraft film adaptation ever made. The 2018 film Annihilation, itself based on the 2014 novel of the same name by Jeff Vandermeer, contains numerous plot similarities with Lovecraft's story, most prominently a colorful alien entity that crash lands on Earth and begins mutating nearby plant and animal life. On January 24, 2020, the latest film adaptation called The Color Out of Space, starring Nicolas Cage and Jolie Richardson, was released.
Look at this.
All those years in the big city, we finally got out. We're living the dream.
Maybe it is a dream.
Then everything just blew up. Big flash, like a pink light. Or actually, I don't even know what color it was. It wasn't like any color I'd ever seen before.
Looks like a meteorite. You think it's radioactive? I mean, it's from space, right? Meteorites are generally no more dangerous than ordinary rocks.
How can something that big just disappear? Did you plant those?
No.
Ward, you come here for a sec.
Oh, God.
What are you doing? Shh. It's talking to me. Who's talking to you? A man in the well.
It's in the static, it's in the moisture. It's in here, it's out there. And what's out there is in here now.
Everything's under control.
Why are you so in denial? That thing from the meteorite changes everything around it.
It's just the color. But it burns.
You believe me now?
I don't know what I believe anymore. Everything's gonna be A-okay.
I highly recommend reading all Lovecraft's works. There is no getting around the fact that in this day and age his views on people in general are problematic. However, his unique take on horror and science fiction cannot be denied. I have been obsessed with him for years. Thank you for listening to Eclectic Obsessions. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe on iTunes. Leave me a review. All 5-star reviews will be read on the show. You can follow the show on Facebook at Eclectic Obsessions, on Twitter at Eclectic Obsess1, on Instagram at Eclectic Obsessions Podcast, and on YouTube at Eclectic Obsessions. I'd love to hear what you think. Feel free to email the show at ecobpod@gmail.com. We'll be back in 1 month's time with a new Eclectic Obsession.